The smell of fresh asphalt and hot steel drifted across my pasture before sunrise. I heard the steady thump of pile drivers long before I reached the old wooden gate my grandfather built with his own hands almost 60 years ago. Every strike echoed across the valley like a countdown. By the time I parked my dusty Ford pickup beside the fence, more than 80 workers were already moving across my land. Rows of shiny solar panels stretched farther than I could see. Tower cranes swung overhead. Concrete mixers rumbled through the grass my cattle had grazed on for generations. Men wearing bright safety vests walked past me without making eye contact. One of them handed me a laminated safety notice and politely suggested I remain outside the restricted construction zone. Outside the restricted construction zone. On my own pasture. I looked beyond the equipment and spotted a giant banner hanging from temporary fencing. Willow Creek Community Solar Initiative. A cleaner future begins today. The HOA logo sat proudly beside the developer's logo. Cameras were already being installed for the grand opening scheduled only 3 months away. My cows stood quietly behind another fence farther down the hill, confused by the endless noise replacing the morning birdsong they had known their entire lives. Then I heard the familiar click of expensive heels on fresh concrete. Charlotte Whitmore walked toward me, adjusting her sunglasses as the bright morning sun hit her white blazer, which somehow stayed spotless in all the dust. Her sunglasses reflected thousands of glass panels sparkling beneath the Texas sun. She glanced at my boots before looking back at my face. "You really should have cleaned this place up years ago," she said. "Your cattle made the entrance to our neighborhood look outdated." She handed me an envelope as casually as someone passing out birthday invitations. Inside was a notice explaining that my pasture had been incorporated into the HOA's Renewable Energy Expansion Plan. There was also a bill for landscaping improvements totaling $12,700. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I honestly thought someone had made a terrible mistake. Charlotte never laughed back. She brushed a speck of dust from her blazer, folded her arms, and calmly pointed toward the construction site. According to her, everything had been approved. Every permit had been signed. Every inspection had been completed. Every investor was celebrating. I folded the notice, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and nodded once. Then I quietly turned around and walked back toward my truck without arguing. She mistook my silence for surrender. My grandfather used to say that patience is most expensive when the other side is paying for it. I was finally beginning to understand what he meant. The workers kept building. The investors kept writing checks. The reporters kept praising the project. Nobody noticed the faded leather document resting inside the metal lockbox behind the seat of my pickup. It had been signed more than 80 years earlier. It looked worthless, and it had almost been forgotten. But within 90 days, that single piece of paper would shut down a project worth more than $180 million, send an entire HOA into legal chaos, and turn every solar panel on my pasture into nothing more than very expensive decorations. Mason Carter. 40 years old. 4th-generation rancher. That was the part everyone in Willow Creek knew. They saw the faded jeans, the sunburned hands, and the old Ford pickup with more miles than most people would believe. They saw hay bales, barbed wire fences, and cattle drifting across open grass beneath an endless Texas sky. They decided they already knew the whole story. They were wrong. My family settled this valley in 1919. My great-grandfather arrived with little more than a small herd of cattle and enough determination to outlast droughts, floods, and hard winters. He believed land was something you borrowed from your grandchildren instead of something you consumed for quick profit. My grandfather expanded the ranch one pasture at a time, shaking hands instead of chasing headlines. He planted live oak trees whose shade still covered parts of the property today. When I was a little boy, he used to sit beside the old windmill every evening. The smell of fresh cut hay mixed with coffee from his dented thermos. He would unfold faded maps across the tailgate of his truck, pointing to the same property lines with one weathered finger. He never talked about how much the land was worth. He talked about responsibility. He said deeds mattered more than fences because fences could fall, but paper remembered everything. I did not fully understand those words until many years later. After college, I surprised almost everyone by coming back home instead of chasing a career in Dallas or Houston. Friends thought I had wasted my education. They could not understand why someone would trade office towers for cattle pastures. The truth was simple. Every sunrise over this valley reminded me who I was. Every cold morning feeding cattle reminded me that honest work did not need applause. Willow Creek Estates arrived much later. One subdivision became 2, and 2 became 5. Asphalt replaced gravel roads, and decorative fountains replaced old oak groves. New neighbors smiled politely when they drove past my pasture, though some complained about slow-moving cattle crossing the county road. I ignored most of it because my ranch had existed long before their entrance signs appeared. Then Charlotte Whitmore became president of the Homeowners Association. She did not see my pasture as history, she saw undeveloped space. Whenever she spoke at public meetings, she used words like modernization, sustainability, and community improvement. She never once used the word heritage. She quietly filed complaints about livestock odors during neighborhood events and argued that my grazing fields lowered property values because buyers expected cleaner views from the clubhouse. Looking back now, I should have recognized the pattern much sooner. Every unreasonable demand was planting the first small seeds of a disaster that would eventually grow far beyond anything anyone in Willow Creek could imagine. Charlotte Whitmore never yelled. That was what made her dangerous. She spoke about community values with the confidence of someone who had never expected to hear the word no. To the newer homeowners, she looked like the perfect neighborhood leader. To me, she looked like someone who confused influence with ownership. The first official notice arrived on a warm April afternoon. According to the Homeowners Association, my cattle were creating an unpleasant visual experience for visitors entering Willow Creek Estates. They requested decorative screening trees along the property line and attached a list of approved species. I read the letter twice before folding it and placing it inside a kitchen drawer. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived claiming my weathered wooden fence projected an outdated rural appearance. Charlotte recommended replacing it with decorative stone walls similar to those surrounding the clubhouse, with an estimated cost of almost $90,000. I did not even bother responding. My grandfather had built that fence one post at a time. Every scratch on those cedar rails carried more history than the entire subdivision. The silent rejection of their demands only seemed to irritate Charlotte further. Within 3 weeks, the Homeowners Association transitioned from polite requests to aggressive legal harassment. Every Monday morning brought a new certified letter to my mailbox. The first fine was for $300, citing unauthorized livestock emissions impacting air quality near the neighborhood perimeter. The second was for $500, listed as failure to maintain aesthetic standards of boundary structures. They even sent a code enforcement officer to measure the height of the weeds along my cedar fence, issuing a daily penalty for every inch over their arbitrary community limit. One rainy Thursday, 2 private security guards hired by the HOA parked their patrol car directly across from my gate. They sat there for 6 hours with a long-lens camera, filming my cattle every time they walked near the water trough. Earl Bennett drove over that evening, tossing a damp newspaper onto my kitchen table. "They're building a paper trail, Mason," Earl said, pulling out a wooden chair and sitting down with a heavy sigh. "I talked to young Miller down at the hardware store. Charlotte's telling the board that you're a rogue property owner intent on sabotaging property values. She's getting the homeowners riled up so they'll approve a special legal fund." I looked at the stack of unpaid HOA fines sitting beside my coffee mug. The total had already climbed past $4,000. "They can print all the fines they want, Earl," I said calmly, pouring him a cup of black coffee. A homeowners association has authority over the lots inside its development map. They don't own the county, and they certainly don't own this valley. "Maybe so," Earl replied, taking a slow sip. "But a hungry dog doesn't care who owns the meat until it gets hit with the stick. She's spending other people's money to fight you, Mason. That makes a person real brave." The next day, I gathered every fine, placed them neatly inside a manila folder, and wrote a single sentence on the front: returned for lack of jurisdiction. I mailed it directly to the HOA board. It was a small declaration, but it drew the line in the dust. They wanted a war of attrition, believing a simple rancher would eventually fold under the weight of legal threats and administrative pressure. They had no idea I was simply letting them pile up their own arrogance. Summer arrived with dry winds rolling across the valley. One afternoon, I noticed survey flags planted along the edge of my pasture. I pulled them out and stacked them neatly near the county road. The next morning, there were twice as many. I drove to the Homeowners Association office. Charlotte welcomed me, resting both hands on her presentation binder, as she calmly explained that environmental consultants were evaluating possible improvements benefiting the entire community. She insisted nothing would affect my property without proper communication. Her voice sounded smooth enough to calm nervous investors, but something about it felt carefully rehearsed. Over the following months, the visitors became more frequent. Engineers carrying tablets walked along the road taking measurements. Men in pressed shirts pointed toward my grazing fields while discussing sunlight angles and electrical capacity. My neighbor Earl Bennett noticed it too. Earl had lived across the county road for nearly 40 years. He leaned against his pickup one evening while watching another drone buzz over my cattle. Earl shook his head and quietly said, "Those people are planning something much bigger than landscaping. Nobody spends that kind of money taking pictures of grass." That night, I sat alone on my porch listening to crickets replace the distant construction noise. Yet somewhere beyond those hills, people who had never owned a single acre of this valley were already making plans that depended on treating my land like an empty space waiting for someone else's signature. The first bulldozer arrived at 5:30 on a Monday morning. Heavy equipment stretched across nearly half a mile of open pasture, and bright orange fencing surrounded areas where my cattle had grazed only the evening before. I parked beside the entrance and walked toward the foreman. He looked genuinely surprised when I introduced myself as the property owner. He checked his clipboard twice before pointing toward a stack of permits clipped inside a weatherproof binder. Every page carried approved county construction permits. The permits covered grading, drainage, and structural work. They did not prove ownership. They did not grant private property rights. At the time, I did not realize how important that difference would become. Before I could ask another question, Charlotte Whitmore arrived in a brand new white sport utility vehicle, exchanging a confident glance with the investors following behind her. She stepped out, thanked me for being patient while the community invested in a cleaner future, and handed me another envelope. Inside was an assessment notice charging me $12,700 for landscape integration and perimeter improvements. I looked from the paper to the workers already removing sections of my cedar fence. Nobody had even paused to ask permission. My cattle had been moved behind temporary barriers without anyone speaking to me first. One young employee actually apologized as he closed another temporary gate, quietly admitting he thought I had already signed everything months ago. That sentence stayed with me. Someone wanted every contractor believing this project had unanimous approval. I asked Charlotte one simple question. "Who signed on behalf of my property?" She answered without hesitation. "Everything has been handled through the proper channels." Then she walked away before I could ask another word. Within hours, concrete trucks rolled across ground that had never carried anything heavier than ranch equipment. Steel posts disappeared into the earth one after another. Earl walked over carrying 2 cold bottles of water. Neither of us spoke for almost a minute. Earl finally broke the silence. "They sure are spending a lot of money for people who never bothered asking the owner." I looked across the construction site one more time. They had already committed tens of millions of dollars before making certain they actually possessed the one thing money alone could never buy. I drove straight to the county records office the next morning carrying copies of my deed, tax statements, and survey maps. Nothing showed that I had sold my pasture or signed away development rights. I contacted the county planning office next. A project manager met me in a conference room overlooking the courthouse lawn. He explained that the county relied on the title certification package submitted by the developer's legal consultants. Their office reviewed zoning compliance, environmental requirements, and construction standards. Questions involving private easements, ownership disputes, or title defects remained the responsibility of the applicant and its legal team. At the time, that explanation sounded routine. Months later, I would realize it explained exactly how everyone missed the same critical document. I hired an attorney with decades of experience in property law. He reviewed everything I handed him before leaning back in his chair. He warned that construction companies often moved faster than court calendars, and filing an injunction could take months while costing well into six figures. My attorney, Arthur Vance, leaned forward and folded his hands over the thick manila folder. "Mason, I've handled land disputes in this county for 35 years, he said, his voice measured and grave. Corporations with this much private equity don't pause for lawsuits. They budget for them. They have a team of corporate lawyers in Austin who do nothing all day but file motions to delay, drag out discovery, and drain your bank account until you can't pay your mortgage, let alone my retainers." He paused, looking at me over the rim of his bifocals. "My advice? Take a settlement. Let them buy out the south pasture at market rate, plus 20%. You'll be a wealthy man, and you can buy twice as much land further west." I looked at the framed historic photos of the valley hanging on his office wall. My great-grandfather didn't fight through the Great Depression just so his great-grandson could cash out when things got uncomfortable, Arthur. "Then you better find a miracle, Mason," Arthur said, leaning back. "Because right now, on paper, the county sees a multi-million-dollar clean energy facility backed by regional utility interests, and they see you as a holdout standing in the way of regional progress. Judges in this district don't like stopping $100 million trains unless you give them a track switch that forces their hand." Over the next several weeks, the pasture changed faster than I thought possible. Thousands of steel frames rose from the ground, and long rows of solar panels reflected the afternoon sun. Local newspapers celebrated the project as the future of clean energy, while television crews interviewed smiling officials. Charlotte appeared in nearly every interview, tilting her head with practiced patience whenever the camera focused on her. She never mentioned my family once. Neighbors started looking at me with quiet sympathy, assuming I had accepted a large settlement or lost a legal fight. Earl stopped by almost every evening, watching construction lights glow across the valley. He finally asked the question everyone else was thinking: was I going to keep fighting? I looked across the pasture and surprised him with my answer. I said no. At least not yet. There was no anger in my voice, nor any panic. I simply folded another stack of documents and placed them inside the old metal lockbox my grandfather had left me. Earl stared at me before shaking his head, thinking I had given up. Charlotte believed the same thing. That misunderstanding was becoming more valuable with every $1 million they poured into a project that still depended on one assumption nobody had bothered to verify. 3 nights after I told Earl I was finished fighting, I went out to the barn. The distant hum of night shift generators echoed across the pasture like a mechanical swarm. I couldn't sleep. The smell of dust and old wood pulled me out to the barn at 2 a.m. I cleared off my grandfather's heavy oak workbench, sweeping away decades of cobwebs, dried grease, and stray metal shavings. Beneath the workbench sat the galvanized steel lockbox. It wasn't just a container. It was a vault of family survival. I pulled out yellowed newspaper clippings from November 1947. The headlines talked about the rural electrification movement sweeping across central Texas, how small ranchers came together when big power companies refused to run poles out to the countryside because there wasn't enough profit in it. There were black and white photos of my great-grandfather standing in a muddy field alongside local farmers, holding shovels, hand-digging the holes for the very first utility poles in the valley. Underneath the clippings lay a stack of hand-drawn survey ledgers bound in brittle string. My grandfather had kept every receipt, every handwritten ledger entry, every dollar contributed by local families who chipped in $5 a month to form the original electric cooperative. They hadn't just used the power, they had financed the lines with their own sweat and meager savings. That was when my fingers caught the edge of the false bottom inside the chest. The hidden compartment gave way with a soft crack of dry cedar. Tucked deep inside was the leather binder containing a deed recorded in 1947. Holding it in my hands, smelling the faint scent of machine oil and 60-year-old ink, I realized this wasn't just old paperwork. It was the ancestral backbone of the entire valley's power grid. They thought they were building on empty dirt, entirely ignorant of the fact that the very dirt had been safeguarded by the men who built the grid from nothing. Attached to the deed was a transmission easement agreement signed by the original electric cooperative, the county judge, and neighboring landowners. The agreement reserved permanent transmission rights to one specific corridor running directly beneath my pasture. Commercial power could not legally be energized through that transmission corridor until the successor owner granted written authorization. Every interconnection agreement depended on one authorization nobody had obtained. My grandfather had highlighted one sentence in blue ink decades ago: any assignment, modification, relocation, or commercial expansion without written consent of the successor owner shall be considered void and unenforceable. The next morning, I drove to the electric cooperative headquarters. An engineering manager named Daniel Pierce welcomed me into his office, but his expression changed the moment I unfolded the original 1947 easement documents across his conference table. He immediately brought in 2 senior engineers and the cooperative's legal counsel. They spent an hour comparing computer maps with the faded drawings from 1947. One engineer quietly confirmed that the transmission corridor matched perfectly. The legal counsel looked up and asked if I had ever signed an authorization allowing the solar project to connect through that easement. I answered with one word: no. Daniel looked at me for several seconds before asking another question. Mr. Carter, are you the Carter family? I nodded. His expression changed immediately. Your great-grandfather helped establish this cooperative in 1947. I smiled. That is why my family kept every original document. Silence settled across the room. Nobody in Willow Creek knew the ranch they mocked belonged to the same family that helped build the valley's first electrical infrastructure. Everyone had assumed someone else verified the paperwork, forgetting that the oldest rights in the valley belonged to the people who laid its very foundation. I left the cooperative without celebrating. They believed the hard part was finished. I knew they had not even reached the beginning. Construction entered its final phase over the next several weeks. Crews installed inverters the size of small garages, and fresh gravel crunched beneath hundreds of tires every day. Charlotte appeared everywhere, praised by local newspapers as the face of sustainable development. Daniel Pierce called me 1 week before the scheduled ribbon-cutting ceremony. Independent surveyors had confirmed the transmission corridor matched the original easement, and commercial interconnection could not proceed without my written consent. He asked whether I was prepared to sign the authorization. I told him I was not prepared to make any decision until every legal review had been completed. He understood immediately. We prepared certified copies of the recorded easement and notified the cooperative through formal legal channels. We did not ask anyone to stop construction. We simply established the recorded facts before the project became operational. The investment group had already funded almost every construction milestone. The lenders had already released nearly all scheduled financing. More than $180 million sat on my pasture, fully constructed and completely helpless. Earl noticed my mood had changed. We sat on the porch one evening watching the final sections of fencing disappear around the facility. I handed him a photocopy from the leather folder. Earl adjusted his reading glasses, read the highlighted paragraph, and slowly lowered the paper. You mean they built this entire place without checking that? I nodded once. Across the valley, fireworks suddenly exploded above the construction site as the developers celebrated completing the installation phase. Bright colors reflected across thousands of solar panels like waves of glass. Music drifted through the evening air, and Charlotte stood on a stage thanking investors for believing in her vision. I watched every celebration from my porch without saying a word. By the time the last firework faded into the night sky, millions of dollars depended on a signature that had never been requested. The atmosphere around the VIP marquee felt like a political rally mixed with a high society gala. Waiters in black tuxedos carried silver trays laden with champagne flutes and delicate appetizers across carpeted runners laid directly over the crushed gravel. A local high school brass band played upbeat tunes near the main gate. Charlotte Whitmore was in her absolute element. She stood near the podium surrounded by local news anchors, regional congressmen, and representatives from the investment firm who had flown in on private jets from New York. This project represents the perfect synthesis of modern environmental stewardship and private enterprise, Charlotte announced into a microphone, her voice booming through the loudspeaker system across the entire valley. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. Where others saw unproductive, outdated pasture, we saw the future. We saw progress. She pointed grandly toward the giant digital LED display clock mounted on the side of the main inverter station. It was counting down from 10 minutes to the moment of grid synchronization. Catering staff began handing out custom-engraved commemorative glass paperweights to the top-tier investors. Standing by the outer chain-link fence in my dusty work boots and faded denim jacket, I was an invisible ghost at their feast. 2 private security guards kept a watchful eye on me, clearly instructed to make sure that disgruntled local didn't cause a scene during the live television broadcast. Earl Bennett walked up beside me, holding a plastic cup of lemonade he'd snuck from the side table. He took a sip and looked at the sparkling, $1 million setup. They sure put on a hell of a show, don't they? Earl muttered, watching Charlotte laugh heartily at a joke made by a county commissioner. Enjoy the music, Earl, I said quietly, adjusting the leather binder under my arm. The curtain's about to fall. Polished golf carts carried investors to the main stage, and television crews adjusted their cameras. Charlotte Whitmore stood beside county officials, smiling for photographs that would appear on front pages before sunset. I parked my old pickup outside the entrance, and walked toward the gate carrying the weathered leather folder. Charlotte noticed me and asked if I had finally decided to support the project. I simply wished her good luck. Shortly before the ceremony officially began, 3 vehicles from the electric cooperative entered the site. Daniel Pierce stepped out carrying a thick binder instead of a ceremonial ribbon. Charlotte greeted him with visible confidence, expecting the final grid authorization, but Daniel handed her a formal notice. I watched her face drain of color as she reached the second page. Daniel explained that the cooperative's final interconnection review had uncovered an unresolved transmission easement issue. Because the review remained incomplete, the energization certificate could not be issued. Without that certificate, the switching sequence could not legally begin. The final energization was suspended indefinitely. The giant digital display prepared to announce first power generation remained frozen at 0. Charlotte insisted there had to be a misunderstanding, asking if another permit could solve the problem. Daniel calmly answered that permits could not replace property rights, and recorded easements could not be ignored simply because construction was complete. Every investor standing nearby suddenly demanded copies of the legal notice. Phones appeared in every direction as attorneys stepped away to make urgent calls. Within an hour, the ceremony had dissolved into emergency meetings. They finally asked if I would consider signing the authorization. I thanked them for asking. It was the first time anyone had done so, and explained that the decision would have to follow the formal legal process they had ignored from the beginning. As the afternoon sun settled over the valley, the panels shimmered silently. Not a single watt entered the electrical grid. The headlines changed before the week was over. Reporters stopped calling it a landmark investment and started calling it a legal disaster. Construction loans entered default after the project missed its commercial operation deadline. Several investment partners immediately demanded repayment. Insurance carriers questioned coverage because the delay resulted from unresolved property rights rather than equipment failure. The financial fallout triggered a cascading disaster that spread through Willow Creek Estates like wildfire. Because the facility missed its mandatory commercial operation date, the Regional Power Authority issued an immediate breach of contract notice, activating severe daily non-performance penalties against the developer. Within 48 hours, the construction lenders froze all remaining credit lines. The news leaked to the financial press, and the investment group's stock price plummeted 15% in a single day of trading. Emergency board meetings were called in Dallas and New York, with executives demanding to know how a $180 million project had been brought to a dead halt by an unrecorded property restriction. But the real chaos erupted inside Willow Creek Estates itself. The Homeowners Association had backed the developer's infrastructure bond with community reserve funds, lured by the promise of long-term utility rebates. Now, with the project dead in the water and legal fees mounting by tens of thousands of dollars a week, the HOA was forced to issue an emergency special assessment to every homeowner in the subdivision, charging each household nearly $4,000 to cover impending legal liabilities. Panic and rage exploded at the next emergency HOA meeting. Homeowners who had previously praised Charlotte Whitmore were now shouting over one another, demanding her immediate impeachment. The decorative clubhouse, once her center of power, became an arena of furious shouting matches. People realized that her blind ambition and personal vendetta against an old ranching family had backed the entire neighborhood into a financial corner. Security guards had to escort Charlotte to her car after furious residents threw copies of the special assessment bills at her feet. The polished, untouchable image she had cultivated for years disintegrated in a matter of days. Charlotte called me 3 days later. Her voice sounded different. The polished confidence was entirely gone. We sat beneath the same live oak tree where my grandfather used to drink coffee. She apologized for how everything had unfolded and admitted the project had moved too quickly without proper verification. I listened quietly before telling her, "Ownership is never measured by who builds the biggest project. It is measured by who respects the smallest signature." She lowered her eyes without answering. Over the following months, Charlotte resigned, and the HOA board elected new leadership that promised transparency. The solar equipment remained silent while formal negotiations proceeded through legal channels. The valley slowly became quiet again. The constant hum of construction disappeared, replaced by wind moving through tall grass. My cattle returned to the remaining pasture each morning as though nothing had ever happened. Earl leaned against my fence one evening, watching the sunset paint the glass panels gold. He smiled and asked whether I had planned every step from the beginning. I laughed and shook my head. I had not planned their mistakes. I had simply refused to erase my family's history. Earl looked across the silent facility and said it was strange that something built with so much money could be stopped by a few forgotten pages. I told him those pages were never forgotten by the people who understood their value. They were only forgotten by the people who believed money could replace patience. Every evening now, I walked the same fence line my grandfather walked. The leather folder rests safely inside the lockbox beneath my workbench, reminding me that the strongest foundations are often invisible until someone tries to build over them. Justice did not arrive because I shouted louder than everyone else. Justice arrived because the truth had been written down long before any of us were born. And the truth, unlike expensive promises, does not stop working simply because people forget to read it.